Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. That is probably the most dynamic entrance for a cyber conference I've probably ever done in my 30 years. We're obviously having a competition for the length of time that we've been involved in security, and actually it's quite an interesting one because I've just done a bit of a tour around our teams in the Nordics, and I mentioned I did my first computer security course in 1989. And when I mentioned that to a bunch of young cyber professionals, they sort of looked at me with a sort of strange look in their eyes when they realized most of them hadn't been born at that time. So that's actually quite a daunting point. But in that sort of time, when I mentioned computer security, you can probably tell by the word computer security that actually it was quite a long time ago, and there has been an evolution, if you like, in terms of the industry in which we're in. I've been through that evolution from computer security to IT security to information security to cyber security and all the branding points in between. But I think there's a really important point in it, and that is that the world is rapidly evolving, and the industry which we work in is rapidly evolving. I just want to put forward maybe a hypothesis for this morning, and that in terms of that sort of changing world. There is a challenge facing us, and I would say that potentially one of the things is if the security industry in which we operate does not evolve and evolve effectively, then actually we are going to become challenged in terms of our relevance. We face a significant challenge to actually be able to address the needs of where the market is going, where the businesses are going, the technology involved, etc. So there is a changing world, and so we sit at a very important time for our industry, and the relevance of what we do has never been greater. So let me just test the hypotheses in a few ways. So firstly, that change agenda. So firstly, technology. Well, it's not a technology problem, right? Well, actually, I think technology is one of those mega trends that really is changing the world in which we sit. Everything we do is technology-enabled, technology-influenced. And the pace of the change of technology implementation is just increasing, and it will continue to increase. We've seen the recent announcements around quantum computing, another game changer, artificial intelligence, the impact of social media, always connected type of world. So technology is at the heart of everything we do and will continue to play an increasingly important part. There's the globalization element. And when you think about the way all of our businesses operate, it is increasingly globalized, despite maybe some of the political trends to nationalize, maybe. I'm a Brit, you can imagine the sorts of things we're going through. But globalization is increasingly an important element of how we need to think about the context in which we operate. And that's absolutely the case in terms of cyber. And demographics. I think we talk a lot about millennials, etc. But I think there's a really important trend in terms of an aging population, but also a younger population, those graduates and those young cyber professionals I talked about, who see themselves absolutely at the forefront of changing a world. And I would say underpinning all of this in terms of these mega trends, there's something called climate change. And you could see where climate change is absolutely a driving component in all of these, whether it's the voting from the population, whether it's the global nature of climate change and the impacts upon it. And actually, technology is probably going to be one of the ways we solve climate change. So there's some mega trends affecting our world and the business environment in which we operate. And that's disrupting us. And we do a regular survey of, if you like, the impact upon industries of those mega trends. And the absolute conclusion is it impacts every single business sector to greater and lesser degrees. And there's some interesting, I think, maybe non-intuitive sort of components of that disruption. So whilst you can see the size of the blob is effectively the scale of change, the axis on the horizontal is the pace of change. And you can see places like travel and leisure. We all know that the introduction of those megatrends, greater movement of people, new technology, etc., is disrupting the travel and leisure industry hugely right now. Financial services may be one of this maybe a slower, more mature, more highly regulated environment. Maybe won't change as quickly, but the scale of change is going to be huge when it comes. So those megatrends are affecting us now and will continue to affect us. And there are serious implications for us as cyber professionals. We do an annual survey of, I think, basically Fortune 500 CEOs. And when we ask them in terms of what do you see the megatrends, what does disruption mean to you, and what are the factors of disruption, really interesting, time and time again, cybersecurity is one of the top national and corporate issues that they see is potentially disrupting the businesses. They recognize that actually in that context there are real challenges around complexity, the protagonists who are involved. We know about organized crime, we hear about nation states, there's single issue environmental groups, for example. The protagonists have very different motivations, but actually have the tools and the wherewithal to execute. But the social and the regulatory environment is playing catch-up in lots of different ways. So cyber is a big issue, but it's highly complex. It's operating in a disruptive environment against some of the megatrends. So it's evolving. It's absolutely evolving, and it continues to evolve, and the speed of that change will continue to evolve. So what are we seeing in terms of those cyber threats, if you like, and the sort of the typical ones we see? And I'll just go through these all relatively quickly, and I'm actually very glad some of these are actually borne out by the first speaker. So phishing, been around a long time, we all know about it, still seen as one of the primary threat vectors for organizations. And we do a global survey, and we've done it for 20 years, so the amount of data we're able to glean from it is really, really quite fascinating. And when we do this, and I think it's generally about 2,000 organizations respond, so we get some really valuable insights. But the trends are really interesting in the way over the last 20 years they've actually changed. Lots of talk about risk at the first, increasingly about technology, and now about incidents and responses. But these elements of it come through incredibly strongly. So phishing, very much so, as one of the primary attack vectors. Right now, operational technology is seen as a very, very high priority for a number of organizations who are affected by it. And I'll come on to a bit of a case study in a second of why that is. But clearly one of the elements in terms of that evolving world is the threats and the attacks affect the operational technology in a way that perhaps was the case for corporate IT a few years ago. But the impacts are potentially significantly greater. So operational technology, hugely important, and I would say, and I'd give a challenge in terms of the evolving cyber functions and professionals. If operational technology is within your organization, actually, do you have a handle on it? Are you covering it in the same level of maturity and expertise as you would for corporate IT? Or, if I could be slightly controversial, is it a silo that actually you struggle to get into because it's a bunch of engineers who actually can't converse in quite the same way as the technology folks? That is a very, very common theme we see. Cyber insurance, talked about a lot, comes through very, very often in terms of a potential way to manage the entire sort of cyber risk agenda. But many organizations are really struggling to understand how to make most effective use of cyber insurance. And actually, the maturity of the cyber insurance market is still relatively questionable, I would suggest. But against those, we see things like organizations, and I think this reinforces the point made earlier, a number of organizations still see their employees as a major challenge in terms of improving their awareness and how they effectively deal with cyber challenges. We also see a significant, and I'm sure this is reflected by everybody, a real challenge in terms of securing the right talent in a highly competitive environment. Cloud security is one, again, that we see repeatedly comes through. And I think, for me, this is a really interesting area. I work with a lot of private equity firms. And when they're talking about investments, etc., one of the very strong messages coming through is actually the adoption of cloud or new technologies is actually seen as an imperative. So again, it's an absolutely key aspect for driving the business forward in the context of those megatrends. However, the problem they see repeatedly is actually concerns about security are preventing the adoption of those new technologies, which would drive the business forward. So security is seen as a disenabler, if that's even a word, a disenabler. It's a brake upon the opportunities in the marketplace, and that is a very dangerous place to be. That is something we've got to address. And finally, the other sort of key area coming through around technology is those disruptors in terms of things like artificial intelligence. We recognize it's here, it's now, it's happening, but actually, have we really capitalized on it from the perspective of cyber and using it as a control, as a preventative measure? So all of these are key trends, all directly relevant, and areas where I think quite often, for security functions, it is a real challenge to get a grip of. So what do businesses think of cybersecurity functions? And again, this is my hypotheses, which I'd just like to test about where we are in the evolution of the functions, if you like. The majority of organizations we talk to have a reasonable security function, and they recognize the professionalism of their security teams. But of the organizations we talk to, only 8% have an organization that fully meets their business needs. That, I find, an incredibly worrying statistic in terms of where we are as an industry and what we've been able to do and position ourselves within the business. Of the organizations we talk to, 38%, a significant proportion, do not believe they would be able to detect a sophisticated attack. So with all of the investment CEOs have put into us over the years, they're still thinking, actually, am I getting my bang for my buck? Over half of organizations that we've talked to see that they perceive themselves to have either no program or an obsolete one for some of what I'd consider the fundamental platforms for managing cybersecurity risks. Some of the basics: threat intelligence. Do you know what's going on around the world? How does it affect you? Identifying vulnerabilities within the organization and the methods and ways about which you go to identify vulnerabilities. Breach detection, as I mentioned, being able to spot it. Incident response, and again, I would say, just to reinforce the point made earlier, having that preparation around the way you tackle breaches is absolutely fundamental. And again, with all due respect, and I'm testing my hypotheses, the cybersecurity function is not the one should wholly own a major business incident. It has to have a highly diverse team involved. Data protection, I have to say, no cyber conference would be complete within the first half an hour mentioning something called GDPR. So I will gloss over that extremely quickly. But data protection and protecting the information assets of a company. We've been talking, as I say, I've been in this 30 years, we've been talking about protecting our information assets for a long time. We still don't seem to have got to the point where we actually, very often, in many situations and organizations, have been able to tackle what our key information assets or systems assets are. And identity and access management, again, one of those absolute key planks of an effective environment, cybersecurity controls environment. Again, hugely challenging and still a massive area for organizations to tackle in many occasions. The final statistic from our survey I just wanted to leave you to sort of position with, and maybe getting back to my hypotheses, is less than 10% of organizations believe they have a mature environment around architecture, the identity management I talked about. They're able to deliver effective metrics and reporting to senior stakeholders, whoever those stakeholders are. They're not able to get into the software and the code, and that actually is quite a shocking and worrying statistic in terms of when we're moving to a cloud environment, when we start to drop applications in an ever-increasing pace. And threat and vulnerability management, and being able to detect within an organization. So from the statistics that we have and the changing world in which we operate, there is still that sort of disconnect somehow where actually are we really delivering the value to an organization at which we have to. So how do you jump the S-curve? So this is, we talk about sort of how do you really impact the business in a way which is perceived to be driving value. And I'll talk maybe just through a life sciences client, which I hope would bring together a number of those, if you like, the mega trends and the challenges of an organization. Again, this is it's a huge organization. It's one which has worked, which has been at the forefront of building security capabilities. They would perceive themselves as relatively mature in the corporate IT space. However, what is very clear is as the threats evolved, the organization hadn't. And when incidents like WannaCry, NotPetya, etc. hit, the disruption in terms of the manufacturing and supply chain was significant. So there's a recognition that actually the focus for so long had been in one area that actually there was an entire shift to a new area, a new threat with significant business implications which they hadn't captured. Or if they had captured, they'd not really tackled those boundaries I talked about. So the challenge back was how does an organization in that sort of context really sort of jump the X-curve, jump the sort of the maturity model. And what they did was look very deeply at the sort of the supply chain, and particularly the factories and the manufacturing component, and wanted to design a framework that could be applied specifically in an OT environment. Again, one of the challenges back to the security function had been, I don't want to see an IT guy coming to talk to a guy in a manufacturing plant about IT. They've got to understand a manufacturing environment. That's just fundamental. So they had to shift and evolve their entire function, the skill sets, who have they got in there, the sorts of people they employ, where do they resource those people from, etc. So build an operating model for a manufacturing environment. They want to be able to detect threats and vulnerabilities in an OT context. And again, that is a different set of tooling. It is a different approach to it. Tools work differently in an OT environment. The change management processes, etc., work differently in an OT environment. So again, different mindset need to shift. And the requirements of the clients was very much around its optimization and availability, so not confidentiality. So again, understanding the requirements of that business to be able to put in place the right level of management. So that's all doable. It's all doable in a way if there is a mind shift, if you like, to be able to put in place an integrated, aligned maybe with the corporate IT and the security function, but a different set of monitoring capabilities, and a deployable model that fits for an OT environment, and what was very clear through doing this was actually it was able to drive a highly cost-effective and some cost savings in terms of the deployment of technologies in that environment. So taking a different approach entirely. And actually, side benefit was able to identify a significant number of assets and drive some asset management in a way they hadn't been able to do before. So again, aligning the functions with the business to drive a degree of business value was absolutely essential to meet the business needs of that organization. So that evolution was absolutely key. So in summary, what would I say? Firstly, in the context of which we operate, agility of mindset is absolutely key. But being able to focus on protecting absolutely what matters and really understanding in the context of the business what matters. And that cuts across organizational boundaries. You need to be able to identify those areas which are vulnerable, but have an eye on the future. As a security function, it doesn't matter just what the past is. What is the future, and what do you need to evolve your teams, your business, to actually be able to address? And whether that's OT, whether it's AI, whether it's blockchain, etc., it's having that forward-looking view and being able to be part of the future discussions of your organization. And I always finish with this because it pains me. It pains me as a cyber professional for many, many years, how we as an industry, we just need to do the basics right. The amount of time we don't get some of those fundamentals in place, which manages the risk to a large proportion. It's absolutely key to being able to deliver the right outcomes for our business. So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. I hope I didn't maybe challenge your worldview too much in terms of the capabilities of us as an industry and whether we're doing the right thing. I do fundamentally believe we have some phenomenal talent. The world is incredibly exciting. I always think cyber can never get bigger, and every year it gets bigger. We have a phenomenal opportunity to really position ourselves as a value-adding business capability. But we have to be flexible, we have to evolve, otherwise I think we will be challenged. And when that breach does happen, I think we'll probably be electrocuted and the next people will be brought in. I hope you have a phenomenal session over the next day or so, and thank you very much for your attention. Thank you.